A wise man once said, "You can buy yourself a pair of Gucci shoes, but you can't buy yourself a Gucci personality." Yo, 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 what's up, everybody? My name is Tyler Adolfo. Thank you for stopping by the channel. I hope that you are all having a wonderful day. The reason I started off this video with that quote is, well, one, it's a quote by me, and two, let's just say there's nothing remotely Gucci about the behavior I exhibited my fall semester of my junior year of college when I was living inside of a frat house. And that is exactly the topic of this video. I'm going to talk about how my life completely spiraled out of control from an undiagnosed illness, which I would later come to find out was bipolar disorder type 1 with psychotic features, experiencing delusions and hallucinations. Where to begin? I'm going to fast forward past my rush and pledge experience in the fraternity because it's just immaterial to the plot of this specific story, which is what it was like being manic in a frat house, what I was feeling, what it looked like in the eyes of others, and how people responded to my mania, how I responded to my mania, because I think it will offer an interesting look at how mania can just completely usurp control of a person's life. But before we get started, I need a drink because my mouth is dry as hell. The jig is up. All right, let's get started. So, the junior year for Tyler Adolfo, it was a humble beginning, and it started off successful. I got myself a full-time job at the Amherst Chamber of Commerce, making excellent money. At least excellent money compared to anything that myself or anyone else in my family has made in the recent past. Up until that point, it was a lot of money for me. I was ecstatic about getting that job. And I also held two positions within my social fraternity. During the pledge process, I was pledge class vice president. I was able to gain a lot of respect. Don't worry, it quickly lost all of it. So I ended up taking on the two positions. I got elected by my chapter of chapter historian. There wasn't really a whole lot to it, I'll be honest. Quite a simple role. And also to the position of public relations chair, or in other words, social media manager. So I would manage the fraternity's Instagram account, schedule and make posts, coordinate posts for different charity events that brothers went to, that sort of thing. So it started off rather successful. I was busy and engaged in social life. I was doing impeccable academically, but it wouldn't be that way for a very long time. Now, there was a major event that happened on campus that was traumatizing for many people, including myself, and that was there was an alleged sexual assault at a different fraternity on campus, not the one that I was a member of, but myself being someone who had been sexually assaulted when I was a younger kid. It really struck a chord with me, and I wanted to do something meaningful and proactive about it. So using my social media manager position in my fraternity, I coordinated with some other brothers on my public relations committee, and we put together a 10-part post on Instagram that raised money for sexual assault survivors and that had a statement calling out and standing against all forms of sexual assault, as well as providing educational material on resources on campus. And I was just immensely happy about the final product. It was so good that I actually got contacted by a reporter from the New York Times, Matthew Berg, and that article in the New York Times is still up online. I'll put a link to it in the description if you want to check it out. The article itself is about fraternity protests across the country at large, but there's a good 2 paragraphs in there where it talks about myself, and it gives in a very abridged recap of the interview that Matthew had done with myself. So after that successful project of being put in the New York Times and raising money for sexual assault survivors, it was the most liked post on the fraternity page in history. Most liked post of any fraternity, any Greek life org on campus. It had over 800 likes, and it had tens of thousands of impressions and views. I started to become overwhelmingly committed to anything and everything that was Greek life related. There was no me time. There was no time that I set aside for myself to decompress and de-stress from everything that I had going on. And there were two events in the fraternity in particular that would take up a large chunk of my time going forward. The first one is that we had a member transfer from a different chapter in a different city. And in order for a member to be inducted into our chapter, they have to get, I believe it was a 2/3 vote approval of the members of the chapter. So even though they're part of Kappa Sigma Nationals, that's the fraternity I was in, Kappa Sigma, it doesn't mean that they automatically qualify for membership in any chapter. They have to be approved by each individual chapter. So when he transferred here, I took on the role of helping him meet the other members of the fraternity so that he can make his impression and to help facilitate his induction into our local chapter and organization. That took tons of time because, there were about 120 members at the time that I was in this fraternity. And introducing somebody to all those people while you're taking a full load of classes and also working and also managing positions in the chapter, it takes its toll on you. And I started to lose sleep. But the sleep loss actually started initially with the Sexual Assault Awareness Project. I assiduously poured so many hours into that project. There was one period of time where I was literally awake for 5 days. And I remember at the end of the project, in our chapter group, a member of my committee and somebody who I was really good friends with had posted, give Tyler a tranquilizer. Because that's how completely burnt out I was from the amount of effort that I put into executing that process of carrying out that project. So the other major event that happened is a pledge who I was great friends with had gotten dropped from the fraternity. And I think this is the point where I think my mania started to inch in, because at this point I was already not sleeping. I was already overcommitting myself, and I was starting to neglect my academics. I was starting to neglect my work, and I was just completely committed to everything fraternity. It was a foolhardy thing of me to do. In hindsight, I would have done things completely differently. I would have picked my battles better. I, would have moved on from things that really aren't that big of a deal. So there was a pledge who was getting dropped, who was a good friend of mine, and I was incredibly distraught by it because I wanted him to make it through the process. And I don't know, for some reason, I just couldn't keep my emotions in check. I was super emotional, super frustrated by it. And I just started to develop a sense of grandiosity where I felt like I was better than other people. And I got this illusion in my head that I knew what I was talking about, but nobody else did. And that only carried forward. In executing my roles, as the semester went on, I began sending out lengthy text messages to everybody. I was disseminating messages all over the place. And when I talk about lengthy text messages, I'm not talking about a paragraph text message that you get and you're like, oh, really? You sent me a paragraph? I'm talking about like entire books worth of text messages. I would read some of the text messages I sent, but I just don't think it would be appropriate. And I don't want anybody's names to be released into this video. I don't think it's part of the decorum of this topic, to be quite frank. Man, I'm weird sometimes. I don't know. But weirdness is the password to all elites, whether it be philosophical, economic, political. I digress. I started to walk a lot, I remember. As the mania started to kick in, there was no limit on the amount of walking that I could do. And on my phone, I would average like 20 miles of walking per day. And I remember comparing to other members in my fraternity, and, they pulled out their phones, their health app, and it would say like 3 miles or 5 miles, at most 8 miles. And then, just on like a random Tuesday, I would have 33 miles on my phone. It's like, where'd you go? It's 1 p.m. How did you walk 33 miles and it's only 1 p.m.? I mean, seriously, what were you doing? And the truth is, this is when I started experiencing a lot of delusions and hallucinations. I had that sense that I was more important than I really was. I started to see synchronicity in everything. I thought that events that happened on campus, occurrences that happened around campus and outside in the larger geographical world, were somehow connected and related, even though they had remotely nothing to do together whatsoever. And things just kind of progressed like that. I remember thinking that the alleged sexual assault at a fraternity was somehow related to political events, and that those political events were somehow related to messages that I was starting to get communicated to me via the television programming. And a really odd thing that happened is I started to have phone calls with people that didn't even exist. And this was, looking back at it, the most frightening aspect of me, realizing that these people that I were talking to were all, figments of my imagination, that they were not real whatsoever. It's frightening to know that your mind can play tricks on you of that scale. It's so frightening. I remember being, in the backyard of the house, pacing back and forth with my phone in my hand, connected to somebody, I don't know who, and I would be talking to people as if I was talking to actual people, having a full-blown conversation. I'd be on the phone for like an hour and a half, but they weren't real people. And, looking back at it, this is what makes me say, bipolar and schizophrenia are really so similar, because you can experience the same psychotic symptoms you have in schizophrenia with bipolar disorder. There's a significant amount of overlap in that regard. So I'm experiencing these delusions and hallucinations, and I ultimately end up getting hospitalized at a nearby hospital called Cooley Dickinson. I got section 12'd, and I ended up in that hospital for approximately 5 days. So this was from around October 27th to November 2nd. And while I was in that hospital, my mania only intensified. I wasn't put on any medication to alleviate symptoms of mania. I will say that while I was in the hospital, despite the fact that I had been a massive jerk outside of the hospital, is that the brothers of my fraternity went out of their way to meet with me and talk with me and see how I was doing. And they did so without passing any judgment, despite the fact that I was living in complete Narnia. They were understanding and empathetic. And I just wasn't in a position at that time with the state of mind that I was in to appreciate the kindness that they were showing to me. Overall, there were about 30 brothers that came and visited me in the hospital. Out of 120, that's a pretty big deal. When, we're talking about busy college kids who are already occupied time-wise, but they still made time in their schedule to come see one of their brothers who was mentally ill and sick. I remember developing the delusion that I had loads of money, that I was completely loaded. The only thing I was loaded with truly is that I was full of crap. But I believed it. I believed that I was rich. I believed that I had more money than Carnegie did when he was alive. And I started telling brothers that, I would give them all this money, and started calling friends, telling them I'd give them this money. I remember having a phone call with my father, who left me when I was 2 years old. And I said to him on the phone that I have a net worth of $150 million. I bet you regret leaving me now. And no, I really wish they would have taken my phone away from me while I was in the hospital, because I was posting sporadically a whole bunch of nonsensical things that, looking back on, are so embarrassing and that just make me ashamed. I just can't believe I posted some of the things that I did, that I said some of the things that I did, that I did some of the things that I did. But it happened. So I was released from the hospital in a worse state than when I entered it. And that's a topic for another video, about how the hospital specifically made my mania worse. When I left the hospital, for some reason, I developed a fear of the brothers in my fraternity. I developed a fear of my close friends and acquaintances even. And I started to have this suspicion that people were Nazis, and that they were specifically after me. And this fear was so rational in my mind, I conceptualized it as being so real that I began carrying around a pocket knife on my person, so that in the event that I had an encounter with one of these Nazis who were after me, I would be able to protect myself and, exercise my God-given right to self-preservation. Thankfully, that didn't come to fruition. But I remember also going back to the house, the frat house, after getting out of the hospital, and the few more nights that I stayed there, I was so scared that I barricaded myself in my room. I moved furniture up against the door and stayed in my room upstairs, and I wouldn't leave it. And I would just stay in there pacing back and forth. I certainly wasn't sleeping. That's one thing, is that I had a complete loss of sleep over the course of my manic episode. I was not getting any sleep whatsoever. And that, of course, was only to the further detriment of my health and the likely intensification of my manic symptoms. So I started accusing brothers of being Nazis, lashing out at everybody all over social media, and I felt so unsafe being in the house, I started sleeping outside, and eventually got to the point so bad, I actually had my cousins bring me home back to where my mom was, and from home, I started posting all over social media, targeting even some of the same brothers who had visited me in the hospital. Make sense of that. There's nothing cogent about what I did. I'm very ashamed of it, and I can understand why everybody started to distance themselves from me. Any reasonable person would do that. I left that hospital scared for my life, and I felt like betrayed, like I couldn't trust anybody, just the very fact that I was in the hospital. And as my delusions and hallucinations continued, and my behavior in person and online continued, people just didn't want to associate with me at all. And how can you blame them? I can't pass judgment there, because I wouldn't have wanted to associate with me either. And ultimately, this tragedy of Tyler culminated with me being expelled from my fraternity for conduct unbecoming of a gentleman. It wasn't my local fraternity that expelled me, although they had a myriad of legitimate reasons and justifications for doing so had they wanted to, and perhaps they would have had time just gone on a little longer. I was actually expelled by Nationals because I had tagged the president of the Nationals organization of my fraternity, the head of all the chapters, the guy who makes the big bucks, cha-ching, cha-ching. I tagged him in a post calling him like a choke artist and a cover-up artist, and used all kinds of threatening, antagonistic language. And I had an email in my inbox about a month later saying that I was suspended, and then a couple months later saying that I was expelled for failing to appear before the Supreme Executive Committee of Kappa Sigma. So that is the story of me living in a frat house while manic. I tried to tell this in a way that allows you to see how my mania escalated as time went on. I hope you got something out of this story. One caveat that I gotta add is that throughout this time of being in the frat house, I was also drinking very heavily, and the reason I was consuming alcohol was actually a way to cope with the stressors I experienced from my manic symptoms. Because my manic symptoms put me in a very stressed state of mind, and consuming alcohol was my means of coping with it. Even though it's a negative coping mechanism, I certainly wouldn't recommend it to anybody. That's just the reality of what I did. So that's my story, the tragedy of Tyler, the former member of Kappa Sigma, who is now an expelled Geed. What can you do? Gotta love the way the story unfolds, right? Just gotta accept it and move on. You can only help but laugh about it because, it was a serious mental illness that took over my life. These weren't things that I would have done had I been in a rational state of mind, but regardless, actions have consequences. And just because you're mentally ill, it doesn't mean you're not held accountable. And in this instance, I was held fully accountable. So even though I'm not culpable, even though I may not be deserving of blame to the degree that someone who's not mentally ill would be, I'm still held accountable for my actions. I'm still viewed as responsible for my actions, and I accept that. But that's the video for today. Thank you all for watching. My name is Tyler Adolfo. Please hit that subscribe button if you are new. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back. If you're new, welcome. I appreciate that you stopped by. I hope that you all have a most extraordinarily excellent day. Peace out, y'all. AK to B.